Most beloved Heavenly Father, Heavenly Parent, we thank you so much for being able to gather again this evening, the fourth day this week, as we trace your providence from the Renaissance through until the birth of our true parents. We thank you so much for all the incredible people who gave so much, sometimes their lives, in order to expand your sovereignty, in order to create a foundation for the Messiah to come, even though they didn't know what they were doing. Yet in hindsight, Father, we can see what they were doing and what it was that they're able to accomplish. Well, they did these things because they're following their original mind, they're following their conscience, even at the risk of their life. And we want to really honor them and respect them. Because also we know that your providence hasn't gone forward in a smooth way, and sometimes through all kinds of crooked ways. And Father, still, however things turned out, you always try to raise people up and find people who could take things on to the next stage and the next step. Father, we ask your blessing upon our study this evening and upon each one here and their families and friends. I ask this in my name, William Haynes of Central Blessed Family, Archie. So, good evening, everyone. Right, so as I said then, what we're doing here, we're tracing God's providence to see how God's providence has developed. And for the past 2,000 years, God's providence, the way in which God's grace has been dispensed, is to create a democratic, social, legal environment which will protect Christ at the second advent. And we've been seeing how God's trying to work through anybody who would be able to respond. God hasn't got favorites. Whoever is willing to respond to God, then that's the person, that's the people that God will work with, and hopefully God will work through. So we're looking now at what's been going on in Europe the last few hundred years, and looking at different parts of European history, the way God's providence developed in different countries. And I've been looking a little bit at England, now carry on looking at that. And so what happened, I can't remember exactly what we talked about last time, how we finished. But anyway, let's carry on. Someone called Charles, so after the death of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, then James I of England and the VI of Scotland, he was invited to become the King of England, Scotland, and Wales. So he titled himself the King of Great Britain and Ireland. That was his way he titled himself. He came from Scotland. He had a son who was born in Scotland, Charles I, and so he succeeded to the throne in 1625. He was influenced, as I talked about before, by this doctrine of the divine right of kings. It was a doctrine, as we'll see, which was developed in France by Jean Bodin, who was a really profound religious scholar and philosopher, but also he was a very profound political thinker, and he thought a lot about the basis for legitimate authority, because there's always something incredibly important. Why should I obey the king? Why should I obey political authority? Why should I obey the law? Why should I obey government? Why can't I just do whatever it is that I want to do? That's the most important question of political philosophy. And so lots of different answers. Living in a democratic society, then we say, well, because our government was elected by us, the people, by the majority, that's why it has legitimate authority. But in the days of the monarchy, then that wasn't a justification. And so Charles I, influenced by Jean Bodin from France, he came up and inherited or liked this doctrine of the divine right of kings. Because the idea, the basis of this then, was that his authority is derived from God. In other words, God had appointed him, and because God had appointed him, he was the king by divine right. Not because of parliament, not because of anything else, not even because he inherited the position, but by divine right from God. And then along with this came the idea that he was above the law, that he wasn't answerable to parliament, he wasn't answerable to the law, and that actually he could do whatever he wanted. And in fact, he only saw himself as being answerable to God and God alone. And so this wasn't a traditional English doctrine, as I explained before. And it didn't go down very well in England, and he has been challenged by the English Parliament. It worked much better in Scotland because the Scottish Parliament is very weak. And so his father was able to get away with a lot of things. But Charles I tried to get away with these things himself, but Parliament wouldn't cooperate. And then one of the main things about English Parliament, it is the only body that has the right or an authority, it goes back to the Middle Ages, to be able to raise taxation, to be able to raise taxes. And so if the king wanted money, he had to ask Parliament for money. Obviously, the king had his own land and he had his own financial resources which supported him and as a monarch, but they weren't enough to be able to run the government. They weren't enough to be able to fund an army. They weren't enough to be able to fund domestic or foreign policy. So if you wanted money to go and invade France or somewhere else, you had to go to Parliament and ask Parliament for money. That's the way it always worked. And so Parliament would decide, and quite often there'd be a negotiation, and parliaments would say, okay, we will give you the money, but in exchange, we want this from you, or we want that from you. So gradually power was transferred from the king to Parliament as part of that negotiation. So it was like a deal. Charles I, though, he didn't see why he needed to make deals with Parliament. So he didn't see why he needed to do anything like that. And so they refused to give him money. And so he started to raise taxes without consent, but he couldn't raise taxes without Parliament, because only Parliament had the authority to do that. So what he started to do is to sell monopolies. So if somebody wanted to engage in a particular business, then you say, okay, I grant you the monopoly to engage in this particular trade, and then he would receive money for selling monopolies in this way, which was actually not illegal, but that's what he was doing. Anyway, so Parliament got on his case, so he decided to dissolve Parliament. Only the king, in England, only a king can call Parliament or dissolve Parliament. That's one of the royal prerogatives, to appoint and dissolve Parliament. So he dissolved Parliament, and he decided he's going to rule without Parliament. So for 11 years, he just ruled by himself. It's actually one of the most peaceful periods in English history, because there were no wars, because the king had no money to go and engage in any wars. So everybody there was no politics, there's no parliament, there are no politicians bossing people around, no new laws were created, no new taxes were raised. So actually, many people are really happy about this. It's just complete stability, yeah? But the king himself, he didn't have any money, and he's running out of money. He's getting really annoyed about this. In terms of church doctrine or religious interests, he was a high Anglican. That means he was at the Catholic end of the Church of England, and people suspected him of being a Catholic. But he wasn't actually a Catholic, but he was certainly a very high Anglican. And then he wanted to, he styled himself the King of Great Britain. And at that time, there was England and Scotland. There was unity of the crowns, but not yet the unity of the parliaments. So he was the king of both. And at that time, there was a Church of England in England, and there was a Church of Scotland in Scotland. There were two separate churches. The Church of Scotland was very Calvinist. One of the main reformers there was John Knox, looked at briefly yesterday. And it had a Presbyterian form of government. A Presbyterian form of government, they had no bishops. Instead of bishops, the congregation would elect elders, and then the elders would govern the congregation, and the elders would interview and appoint ministers. That was their government, and that was their church structure. And they would have their own kind of prayer book and things like that. So Charles I, though, he wanted to unify England and Scotland. And one of the ways that he thought was really important that everybody in England and Scotland should worship God in the same way. So he tried to impose a modified book of the Book of Common Prayer, which is the Church of England prayer book. He tried to impose a modified version of this on Scotland. Anybody who knows the Scots knows that is not a good move to make. And they got really annoyed. about that. Even though he himself had been born in Scotland and his dad was Scottish, yet actually he didn't really get the way the Scots were. And because he was influenced by this kind of doctrine. Anyway, so Scots got a bit annoyed, and so they had a big meeting and they had a national covenant. Again, the word covenant. You remember that was very prominent in the Mayflower Compact. Again, it's a deeply religious. The Scots, steeped in the biblical tradition, steeped in the Bible. When they went to war, they used the Bible actually as for tactics, and so they made a covenant. And they decided they're going to rebel. Anyway, so Charles I realized he needed some money. And so he decided the only way he can get enough money to deal with the Scots was to recall Parliament. So he recalled Parliament, but the MPs were not at all happy with him. Instead of just doing what they were told, they started moaning, complaining, and they decided they started to make moves to start to impeach some of the royal officials and start to, deal with the king. And so he didn't like this. And so he dissolved Parliament again in 1640. Then the Scottish Covenanters, they invaded England. They raised an army and they invaded England. And I think they got about as far as Newcastle, or they crossed into Berwick and Tweed and got about as far as Newcastle. And then they basically they packed their bags and went home. But anyway, the Scottish army invaded England. And then he needed to go and raise an army to fight against the Scots. And so again, he recalled Parliament to raise money. But as soon as Parliament was recalled, they started to impeach some of the royal officials, like Archbishop Laud and various other royal officials who they thought had been acting ultra vires. In other words, had been acting against the law, as if they were above the law. And so they started to impeach them. So that's where you get this impeachment thing comes along, with Donald Trump in America. That's what was going on here. So they impeached some of the royal officials. This really annoyed Charles. And actually, when they impeached these royal officials, Parliament found it hard to find laws that they'd broken. And this became a problem, to be honest. They couldn't find laws that these royal officials had broken. And so they started basically to have I think it's called I can't remember what it's called now, basically to punish them without breaking the law. It was a very, very complex legal situation, a lot of complexity going on there, very complicated. Anyway, so this went on for a couple of years, and then finally the king decided to raise his standard, called people to his support against Parliament, and they had a war there the civil war between the Cavaliers supporting Charles I and the Roundheads supporting Parliament. And Parliament initially did pretty badly. Then someone called Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan from East Anglia, he was much more disciplined, and he raised a new model army, which is the first sort of modern army in England. It's incredibly well disciplined. They fought against the Cavaliers, and eventually Charles I was defeated. And then he was tried, and he was beheaded in 1649. Again, there wasn't really a legal basis for doing this, but they did it anyway. So again, it's very controversial. A lot of people thought it was the wrong thing to do. Anyway, that's what happened. A bit like what happened to the Ceausescus in Romania. They tried to have a court case to prosecute them, but in the end they just executed them. And that's basically what happened here. So having got rid of the king, then England became a republic. And the period is called the Commonwealth period. It was a republic, and there was a lot of confusion having executed the king. Who is going to be, where then is going to be the source of legal political authority? And so there were lots of arguments, lots of discussions. Who should have the power? Should it be Parliament? The Parliament was in a mess. And then the army, the new model army, they had an army council. And so they became very powerful. And then Oliver Cromwell, then he was made the Lord Protector by the Army Council. Nowadays, you call it a military dictatorship. And Parliament carried on for a bit, but it was a mess. A lot of confusion, a lot of political confusion. They weren't able to govern well. And so basically there was a rule by the army. And so Cromwell then, he lived at Hampton Court, the Lord Protector. Basically, he was a dictator. But as dictators go, he wasn't such a bad dictator. So he ruled personally, but then he decided, the basis for the English, for the basis for what they were doing was to limit the power of the king. They weren't trying to seize power to remodel society in a certain way. It's not like the French or Russian or other revolutions, where the group of social reformers who seize power so they can engage in social engineering and use the power of the state to remodel society and the economy. That's not what's going on here. It's actually about reducing the power of the state. Anyway, so Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Protector, he didn't create any new laws, but he realized you need to have a legal authority, a legal basis for what's going on. So he asked a judge, the most respected judge in the country, to become the Lord Chief Justice. I think it was Hale, I think his name was, I can't remember. Anyway, so this judge said to Oliver Cromwell, I don't acknowledge your authority. You are an illegitimate ruler. You do not have the authority to be the Lord Protector. It's illegal. You do not have the authority to appoint me to be Lord Chief Justice. And Oliver Cromwell said, I don't care what you think. All I want you to do is to apply the law. That's it. Just apply the law of England, English common law. So he didn't want to create new laws. He didn't want to remake society. He just wanted to have England governed as based on the rule of law. And so I thought that was really interesting. Usually dictators want people who are loyal to them. Usually dictators want to be surrounded by people who are sycophantic, who worship them and look up to them. But Oliver Cromwell wasn't interested in that. He didn't care whether, he just wanted to have a good judge. Whether that judge respected him or liked him or not, or was going to obey him or not, or was going to be loyal to him, that didn't bother him. So I thought that's a really interesting character. He's a very profound religious thinker, a very strong Puritan. And anyway, if you look at the painting, I haven't got it here, I forgot, Oliver Cromwell, and you look at the painting of his face, it's kind of ugly. And you might think, well, he's rather an ugly person. But the interesting thing is when he sat for this portrait, then the person who's painting the portrait wanted to paint him looking really handsome, which is what most people want, a portrait which presents him in the best possible light. But Cromwell said, no, paint me warts and all. In other words, I got warts here, but I want you to include those in the picture because I wanted to be an honest, open, transparent picture of what I really look like. So that's the kind of person he was. Then you had various religious reforms that were brought about by Oliver Cromwell. The first thing he did was to abolish the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Uniformity meant that everybody was something brought in by Queen Elizabeth, where all Christians had to worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. And they all had to go to the Church of England, etc. And so this uniform kind of religion based on the Book of Common Prayer. So he abolished the Act of Uniformity. And also the Church of England then, again, these are some of the demands from the Puritans. The Church of England then was reformed and the episcopate was abolished. So there are no more bishops and it is reformed along Presbyterian lines like it was in Scotland. So these are the kind of reforms that James I resisted. If you remember, he said, no bishop, no king. And that's what happened. No king, no bishop. And so there's no more bishops, became a Presbyterian government in the Church of England. The Act of Uniformity was abolished. So that meant people didn't need to go to the church. If they went to church in the Church of England, then they could worship God in the way they wanted to. But then there were lots of people who said, well, we don't even need to go to the Church of England. So lots of sects developed. There are lots of independent churches developed, lots of independent separatists. And there are lots of them. There were, during this period, the Commonwealth is basically complete religious freedom because the Act of Uniformity is abolished. There's complete religious freedom. People could form their own little groups to worship God in the way they wanted to. And there are lots of different groups. There are groups called the Ranters, incredibly anti-clerical against bishops. They believed in God, but in a very, very egalitarian kind of way. There were the groups called the Fifth Monarchists who, anyway, they want to bring about political reform. They talked about the 4 great empires of the past and Babylon in the Bible. They saw themselves as being somehow the 5th group. They wanted to seize power. Later on, they tried to stage a coup d'etat. There were seekers trying, a very spiritual group trying to seek for God in an independent kind of way. There's a group called the Muggletonians. There's a group called the Quakers. This is nowadays they're called the Quakers or the Society of Friends. The great leader for that was George Fox, who's guided by this inner light. So all of these groups, they want to be guided by an inner light, a spiritual light. But they're all of them, they form these many, many different groups. And the Quakers then, they would meet together and they would sit around in a circle, and they were called Quakers because they started to quake. When they started to feel the Holy Spirit, they started to shake, they started to quake, and they started to prophesy. And anybody could do that. They didn't have a priest, they didn't have a minister. They would just sit around waiting until anybody in their society of friends could start speaking in the way they felt the Holy Spirit was guiding them to say something, some kind of message. So again, it's incredibly egalitarian. They were just friends. Yeah, like Jesus talked about that. You are my friends. He talked to his disciples and said, you're my friends. So that was their ecclesiology. Yeah, Jesus called us his friends. So we're just friends. We're all just friends together. So you had this incredible religious pluralism that happened during this time in the Commonwealth. And lots of really weird millennial groups believing the second advent was going to come. At this time, you had people like William Blake. Some of you may know this hymn, Jerusalem and those feet in ancient times, walk upon England's mountains of green. You had William Blake at this time. This idea that the Messiah was going to be born in England. The Puritans who went to America to create a city on a hill, New England and everything, they were the ones who went to America. But most of the Puritans stayed behind in England, and they were trying to create a new Jerusalem in England. Yeah, the same kind of vision the American Puritans had. A lot of these people, then 20 years later, they came to power in England, and they were trying to create that kind of thing. So they're very, very strict in terms of their religious application of religion, in terms of morality. Also, there's a lot of free thinking at this time. Something called Putney debates. Again, 100 years later in America, you had the constitutional debates with Jefferson and Washington and the Federalist Papers, all these things. 100 years before this, after the execution of Charles I, then everyone was thinking, well, we cut the king's head off. Where do we go from here? What then becomes a source of authority? Only the king had the authority to call parliament and dismiss parliament. Well, if the king is dead, who has the authority to call parliament? This is a real question. Is parliament then legitimate? This is something which the earlier reformers didn't do. With the Magna Carta, they didn't cut John's head off. They just wanted to reform things. When we looked at the Mayflower Compact, they still acknowledged the authority of King James. Yeah, but here they didn't acknowledge the authority of Charles I. They cut his head off. But then what becomes the basis for legal authority then when you do that? And so there are lots of debates, the Putney debates, where lots of people got together. They argued about this. What kind of government should we have? There's some who are arguing more like in a sort of communistic kind of way, some arguing about the redistribution of wealth, the abolition of private property. universal male suffrage, everybody should have a vote, except there are all kinds of incredibly radical ideas which are going around. And they were so radical, it was impossible to find any kind of consensus. You know, a lot of these debates are minuted, and the minutes were not, anyway, they're only rediscovered in the 19th century. Incredibly radical political ideas, almost complete freedom of speech in terms of political discussion, debate. But it's very, very clear there was nowhere to go. Cromwell and the Army Council realized this isn't going to go anywhere. It's just going to end up and degenerate into anarchy, which will be social chaos, which is the last thing you want. When you get social chaos, then you get a failed state. And there are enough failed states now in the 20th century to realize that's not where you want to end up. It's really important to maintain social order and discipline. Otherwise, when you have a failed state, there's no social order, there's no law, and then it's just the strong are the ones that rule and the weak are the ones that suffer. And so it's a recognition that was a real possibility. So that's why Cromwell very wisely became the Lord Protector. No parliament, none of these debates, just you apply the law. And so you had the magistrates who were ruling and applying the law. So the bad people were arrested, put in prison and punished. And as I said, it was a very, very peaceful time, actually, in reality, very, very peaceful. So it averted this social breakdown into anarchy, and a very peaceful time. But at the same time, you had a lot of free thinking and free speaking. And so you had Milton, who I mentioned before, arguing for freedom of the press. And again, a lot of religious literature came out of this time. There's John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, and lots of other people. So it's incredible religious ferment, incredibly religious England at that time, with this deep expectation that the Messiah is going to come, living at the time of the Second Advent. At the same time, that was some of the religious side, but at the same time, you had the rise of the Enlightenment developed at this time, something called deism, which again is referred to in the Divine Principle as someone called Lord Herbert of Cherbury. Again, during this time in the Commonwealth, he started to realize, well, all these religious people, they're all arguing. So many different denominations, so many different sects, so many different cults, so much religious confusion. What can intelligent people think and believe? So he's basically a rationalist. He said, okay, we need to have a theology based upon reason. Yeah. So let's think about it. It became like a natural theology. Divine principle creation is a bit like this. You say, okay, there's only one supreme God. Okay, and God should be worshipped. Well, why should God be worshipped? Well, God created the universe. God created us. Therefore, God is our creator. Therefore, God deserves to be respected and to be worshipped because he is our creator. And then, okay, how do you worship God? Well, one way to worship God is through living a virtuous life. So virtue and piety are the chief parts of divine worship. Live a good life, be a virtuous person, practice the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, and live a pious life. And that's the main point. It's not so much about theology. It's not so much about the Nicene Creed. It's not about all this really complicated stuff. It's not about miracles. It's just something rational, reasonable, a reasonable Christianity, you might say. At the same time, there was a spiritual dimension. We ought to be sorry for our sins and repent of them. Yep, that was good. Also, divine goodness does dispense rewards and punishments both in this life and after it. So there's a recognition here that there's God. God rewards the good by going to heaven, and God punishes the people who commit sin and don't repent by sending them to hell. So there's justice in this world. So God is a good God. God is a God of justice. The good people are rewarded and the bad people are punished. So again, in earlier kind of lectures about Moses and the Old Testament, I explored this whole idea of divine justice. So that's deism. And so that was Lord Herbert of Cherbury. He was a sort of earliest deist. The other ones who came after him, emphasizing here theology based only on reason. Okay, so then some other who came along, just three names here, Toland, Tyndale, and Collins, they were also very religious, but they started to use reason to study the Bible. And this is the beginnings of biblical criticism. So when they started to study the scripture, they realized that all these different contradictions, which I mentioned before, contradictions in the Bible. And so when they started to study it, it looked like the whole New Testament and the Bible started to fall to pieces. And so this is the beginnings of biblical criticism. And that's why they realized you need to have theology based on reason, you can't have it based upon revelation. And so this is going in the direction, okay, so when you start having biblical criticism, anybody that's engaged in biblical criticism, and you start to study it, it's very easy to become very skeptical. You think, well, if the Bible is full of these contradictions, how can we say the Bible is the word of God? How can we regard the Bible as revelation if it's so full of contradictions? How can we say the Bible is true when there's contradictions? How can we recognize the Bible having authority within our life? And then it becomes a real problem, as a lot of people, are aware of. And then people's faith then becomes shaken. Okay, if I can't trust the Bible, if I can't rely upon the Bible, then what can I rely upon? So the whole Protestant movement was coming back to the Bible as the word of God. But then when you start studying the Bible using reason, it starts to fall to pieces. Then again, well, what can I base my faith upon? I can't base it on the Pope. I can't base it upon tradition. I can't base it on the Bible. So what do I base it on? Yeah, and so that's why, okay, reason. But then, as I said, it became, very, very skeptical. Anyway, in England, there were a lot of very intelligent Christians who were intellectually engaged with the deists. And because of a lot of freedom of speech, freedom of publication, then there are lots and lots of pamphlets. So Toland, Tyndale, Collins, and lots of other people who are deists of all kinds of different degrees, they wrote lots of pamphlets. But on the other side, there were lots of others who wrote pamphlets in response to their pamphlets. And so there were lots of intellectuals within the Anglican Church, within the church. Somebody called William Law, he wrote a book, A Serious Call to Devout and Holy Life. And also Bishop Butler, he wrote an analogy of religion, natural and revealed. And these are two of several very, very prominent Anglican divines who led a very deep and profound spiritual life, and who showed and who revealed the limitations of reason. Yeah, the deist argument was based upon rationalism. Everything should be based upon reason, and everything, you should be able to give a rational explanation for everything. If something is not rational or not logical, it can't be true. In other words, everything has to have a rational basis. So Bishop Butler, he showed the limitations of reason. He showed actually, it's like a critique of reason. There's certain things which you can understand using reason, with a lot of things which are beyond rational comprehension and understanding, but that doesn't mean that they're not true. And so these two intellectuals particularly, they defeated deism in England. And so the deists, then they were just one voice amongst many. So there are lots of intellectuals who felt, okay, I understand all of this, but at the same time, it's still intellectually respectable to be a Bible-believing Christian. And so you might say Satan's invasion of the Cain-type view was defeated. So there's a possibility here of deism going through this biblical criticism into extreme skepticism and into atheism and into materialism. Yeah, and the intellectual class within England becoming atheistic and materialistic. But because of the intellectuals, because the Church of England was very intellectually engaged and very active, then they're able to engage with these kind of people and defeat them intellectually. And so a lot of people within English life remained Christians. Anyway, so we look at the development of the Enlightenment thought, empiricism. How did empiricism develop within England? That was the rationalism rationalism was defeated within England. And so the English intellectual life developed much more on the basis of empiricism. So one of the earliest was someone called Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book called Leviathan. He lived during the Civil War. During the Civil War, there's complete social breakdown. You had families split because different brothers fought on different sides in the Civil War. Fathers and sons fought on different sides in the Civil War. Civil War's incredibly divisive. Yeah, we almost went through something very similar in this country, in England and in Scotland recently. In Scotland, over the debate about Scottish independence and the referendum, was incredibly divisive socially within Scotland until today. A lot of bitterness has remained. And also in England, there's a lot of bitter debate about Brexit, and that debate still remains. It's been very, very difficult. And so Hobbes then, he realized actually it's really important to have a political authority. So that's really important. We realize that today when you get a failed state, it's really hard to re-establish order in a failed state. Because people say, well, on what authority do you claim to have authority? Yeah, very difficult to re-establish order in Afghanistan or Somalia or any of these countries, Syria, these kind of countries, which Libya, where it breaks down. So basically, he was an advocate of what's called Leviathan, absolute authority by a ruler, as long as he maintains social order. Then you had somebody called John Locke, came along a bit later. One of the people who justified the Glorious Revolution. He was an empiricist. And empiricism basically believes that you gain truth from experience, by observation. Oh, this is what works. This is what's true because it's based upon experience, based upon experimentation, talked about before. And also he was a theorist of liberal democracy. He wrote a couple of treatises on government, one in which he critiqued paternalism, and the second in which he advocated basically what now looked at as liberal democracy. Not exactly, but that sort of thing, very influential in the American founding fathers. So after the empiricism then came the idea of liberal democracy. And also he wrote a book called Reasonable Christianity. So he was an empiricist and a philosopher, but he's also a very deep Christian. And he wanted to provide an intellectual basis for Christianity, basically in a deist kind of basis. Then you had Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists in history, really. Great mathematician, one of the people who developed or invented calculus, physics, the laws of gravity and various other laws of dynamics, developed, Galileo's ideas. Same time, he was an alchemist, and also he was a very profound religious thinker, not a conventional religious thinker, but he wrote lots of commentaries on the Bible, which he thought were really important. And then you had Bishop Berkeley, who was the second major empiricist. The key is he is a bishop. So again, the empiricism, the Enlightenment in England developed within the church. All the leading philosophers within England were all Christians, devout Christians. You had Berkeley, Locke, William Law, Lord Herbert of Cherbury, Bishop Butler. So the Enlightenment took place within the church, which is really significant. So when the Enlightenment took place, it was infused by the Christian spirit and spirituality. It inherited Christian spirituality, Christian morality and ethics, and just sought to give integrate these things. One thing about empiricism, though, because truth comes from experience, of course, everybody's experience is different. And so it's very easy to lead into skepticism, which we saw what was going on there. So the English tradition tends to be rather skeptical about authority, rather skeptical about rationalism, rather skeptical about everything. And so that's what happened. Anyway, a few more political changes. So after Oliver Cromwell died, then again there's a lot of confusion. Who's going to be? What's going to happen next? So some of the Army Council, they wanted his son, Richard Cromwell, to become the Lord Protector. He really didn't want the job. And so that wasn't going to go. And so you had the restoration of the monarchy. So the royalists got together. They invited Charles II, who'd been hanging out in France, to come back. He was the son of Charles I. He came back and the monarchy was restored, and they tried to pretend that all these years of the Commonwealth just didn't happen. So reintroduced an active uniformity, tried to restore the Church of England to the way that it was before, reintroduced the Book of Common Prayer, reintroduced the episcopate, decided that all the people who had been involved in the execution of his dad, Charles I, should all be arrested and punished, and quite a few were executed. So it was like a sort of reactionary kind of movement here, the restoration of the monarchy. Anyway, he died, and then his younger brother became the king, James II. And he was, again, they were both quite high Anglicans, verging towards Catholicism. This kind of restoration of Anglicanism is like moving in the direction of that. James II was an interesting character. But soon after he became the king, he declared Declaration of Indulgence. This Declaration of Indulgence is religious freedom for Catholics and for Protestants. He declared religious freedom for Catholics and for Protestants. But the Church of England didn't like it. They wanted the active uniformity. They wanted everyone to go to the Church of England. And so, Anglicans were trying to turn the clock back, trying to reverse all this incredible flowering of spirituality and freedom which had taken place during the Commonwealth period. Anyway, so James II then, he wanted to try and continue this and grant trying to realize, well, we've got to try and find something that's going to work. Uniformity is not going to work. We have to allow Catholics and Protestants and all these funny little groups to worship God in the way they wanted to. They were called nonconformists. When the Act of Uniformity came along, there were lots of people who refused to conform to the Act of Uniformity. They were called nonconformists. A lot of people who were bishops, they refused to conform. William Law, he was a nonconformist. He refused to conform to this. So the nonconformists of dissenter tradition, they were called dissenters. They dissented and they wanted to have their own independent churches, their own independent chapels. There were Baptists and all the Quakers and all these funny little groups who wanted to carry on. They refused to conform to what Charles II wanted. So, of course, this causes a lot of social and political instability. Because a very, very powerful force. About half the population were now nonconformists, not members of the Church of England. Half the population. But the Church of England, the Anglicans, wanted to try and make things the way they were before the Civil War. Anyway, so James II then, he thought, okay, one way to make myself popular is to grant religious freedom for everybody. But the Church of England didn't like this. A lot of the establishment didn't like this. And so a lot of the nobles, with the support of the Church of England, got together and they decided they were going to overthrow James II, and they invited William of Orange to come. The William of Orange then was a Protestant, and so the excuse was to try to preserve the Protestant England as a Protestant country. The issue was partly they thought, okay, we can live with Charles II and James II. James II had a son. It had these tendencies towards Catholicism. So this Declaration of Indulgence, people suspected the reason why he's granting religious freedom to Catholics is because eventually he wants to make England a Catholic country. So there's a lot of suspicion towards what he was doing. And so to secure the Protestant, as England is a Protestant country, then William of Orange is invited over in the Glorious Revolution. Yeah, so as I was saying, that's what happened here. You might wonder, why is it called the Glorious Revolution? Well, people say because it's peaceful. The other reason is because the people who led the revolution became the establishment, and they didn't want to give the impression it was anything other than a legitimate transfer of power. So it's interesting to look at James II here. They said he had this Declaration of Indulgence, religious freedom. And that sounds good, and it was good. But the point is, the question from an English point of view is, did he have the authority to do that? Did he have the authority to declare a declaration of indulgence and to allow that? The point is no. He didn't have that authority. Only Parliament had that authority. So the Glorious Revolution then was basically about re-establishing the authority of Parliament. To say the King, James II, he didn't have the authority to do the things that he was doing. Just like Charles II and Charles I before him, they were just getting too authoritarian and thinking because they were kings, they could do whatever they wanted. So even though it was a good policy, the question wasn't was it a good policy or not a good policy. The question was, did he have the authority to make that policy himself? And people felt, no, that's not right. So when William of Orange was invited, the reason he was invited, not only because he's a Protestant, but his wife, Mary, she was the granddaughter of a previous king. And so she had a legitimate right to the throne, perceived to be like that. And so when William of Orange came, then there was a negotiation about what the relationship between the monarch and the Parliament was going to be. So in that negotiation, then Parliament established its rights and then made sure that William Orange and other kings didn't break the law, didn't go beyond their authority. So that became that. Anyway, so after this time, then there's also a lot of further spiritual renewal. The Church of England, which as I say is Anglican, became rather ossified and rather spiritually dead, you might say. There's a doctrine called latitudinarianism, and it's incredibly rational because they had a certain legacy from the Enlightenment, but it became a very rational kind of religion, very unenthusiastic. And so there's a general feeling within the Anglican Church against enthusiasm, against, don't be too enthusiastic about your religion. Why? Because during the Commonwealth period, you had a lot of people who were incredibly enthusiastic about their religion, the Muggletonians and the Quakers and this group and that group. And there's so much religious enthusiasm around, and the Anglicans basically didn't want too much of that. Anyway, so you had this person quite a bit later, John Wesley. He was, I can't remember now, I think he was about the 11th or 12th child or even 13th child of his mother. And his dad was an Anglican priest, minister, and his wife had all these amazing number of children, ran this extraordinary big household. How she managed to get the laundry done is beyond me. And all her children were brought up incredibly well educated and incredibly knowledgeable and brought up to be incredibly devout. And, John Wesley was one of them. And his brother, Charles Wesley, was worked together with his older brother, worked together with him, and he was the author of many hymns. Anyway, so Wesley then, he was went off to America, and he was always struggling over his faith. Is he really saved or not? Is he saved by God? Has God forgiven his sin? Is he like that? And he went to church. I can't remember the church now. There was a church in London he went to, which was very much influenced by the Moravians. These were coming from sort of some Hussite kind of background, very pietist, influenced by the pietist tradition. And he was sitting there in this church, and then suddenly he said he felt his heart warming, and he felt God's presence, and he knew that God loved him. And this changed his life. And then he started to give sermons, and, people really felt, not that he was particularly enthusiastic, but he used to give sermons, and people felt that their heart, their soul was touched by God. And then people started to cry out. They started to publicly repent. They started to break down into tears of repentance and coming to believe in Jesus and to be born again. And Wesley himself found the whole phenomena rather odd in some ways, because that's not the way he was. But there's no doubt whatsoever people felt that God is actually working through him and speaking through him, and people's lives were touched when they went to listen to him speaking. And so he's invited to place after place. But the establishment, even though he was a, I said, Church of England vicar, but the establishment didn't like him so much because he was very enthusiastic, and you know, all the people who came to church were incredibly enthusiastic about his sermons. And so he was sort of squeezed out by the establishment. And so he started to preach in the open air. Now, particularly went to preach in the cities. This is during the Industrial Revolution. The cities started starting to develop. There weren't very many churches within the cities. And he started, the reason he's called a Methodism, because he just started to develop a method for living a spiritual life. He went to Oxford and he had a group of friends. They wanted to develop a systematic, methodical spiritual life of prayer and study and confessing their sins to each other and this sort of thing. And so he started these Methodist circles where Christians would gather together, a bit like the Society of Friends. They would gather together, they would form their own little spiritual communities, studying the Bible together, praying together, worshiping together. And of course, they go to church on Sundays. And then this movement became very, very large. He himself, he traveled hundreds of thousands of miles on horseback. He gave tens of thousands of sermons. He wrote lots of books. He's an incredibly intellectual, well-educated person. He corresponded with scientists and with Swedenborg and people like this. And his focus then was on personal and social regeneration. Now, it's important, two dimensions here. A personal dimension, having a personal transformation within one's life, but also incredible focus upon social change and social regeneration. So after he died, the Methodist Connection, as it's called, they separated from the Church of England and they formed their own church. Now it's called the Methodist Church. And but the focus very much is on social regeneration. And so people became Methodists. So they're working very much in the cities. People became Methodists and then they stopped drinking. So associated with Methodism is the temperance movement, giving up alcohol. Because there are lots of people in the cities that drink a lot of gin, they go to the pubs, they get drunk. This led to huge personal problems, but also, of course, it led to huge problems within the family and huge social problems. When people became Methodists, when their lives are touched by the Holy Spirit, they stopped drinking one day to the next. And so out of the Methodist Church developed the temperance movement. And of course, then the men, they had this personal transformation change when they went to the factory and they came home from the factory on a Friday with their wages, their little envelope with all their money. Then they'd give it to their wife. And the women then within these kind of churches became very influential in the family. The women managed the finances, the women managed the household and how everything's organized. And the wife would then give her husband some money to go and spend on his own personal things. So instead of spending all the money on drinking and going home without any money, and the family starving, and the wife tearing her hair out, Wesley and the Methodists encouraged their men to go home, give the money to your wife, let her manage the household finances and affairs. And so this led to huge transformation. So this took place within the working class, but because of this personal and familial and social transformation, this led to a huge change in the social circumstances of Methodists. And so they started to go to school, started to get more education, and so they started to become more middle class. And so this led to huge social transformation. And they started to get involved in trade union movement. And most of the working class institutions in Britain, they were started by Methodists. Trade unions were started by Methodists. Methodist groups within factories are called chapels. The person who's a trade union leader used to be called the father of the chapel because it's grounded in Methodism. Trade union movement developed grounded in Christianity. And then in terms of social generation, the Methodists, they went into socialism. So the roots of socialism within Britain also lie within the Methodist Church. It's called Christian socialism. It's an incredibly influential movement. It transformed Britain. And, people say that was one of the main reasons why there was no equivalent to the French Revolution in Britain, because of what happened here. And then he also went to America, and then there's another English preacher called George Whitefield. He also led to the evangelical revival. This wasn't just happening within the Methodist Church. There's also an evangelical revival within the Anglican Church as well. And he also particularly went to America, focused there, led to the Great Awakening in the American colonies. Whitefield actually more people brought to Christ by Whitefield and his preaching and his sermons than by Wesley. But there's a difference. Wesley left the church. Whitefield didn't. Okay, the difference is that when Wesley went to a town or a city, he stayed there and preached and preached and preached, and he invested time into the lives of the people who accepted Jesus into their lives and started these circles. And so started these circles, study circles, which later became spiritual communities, which later became churches. George Whitefield thought, well, once a person is saved and born again, that's enough. So he's always moving on from one group of people to another group. So he didn't invest in the people who become converted. They were converted, they're saved, they're born again, they're being forgiven by Jesus, but he didn't invest in setting up some kind of network. And so there's a big difference there. Anyway, both of them very influential. And so this is what was going on in Britain then. You had this religious freedom and pluralism. And so as a result of that, the whole of English society became touched by Christianity. Even until today, there's nothing, basically up until the 1960s in England, there was nothing that didn't have a Christian foundation to it. With the evangelical revival within the Anglican Church, you had the focus on going to study the Bible. People were illiterate. So you need to start Sunday schools. So churches started the Sunday school movement, developed out of this, where children would learn how to read so that they could read the Bible. And then it became not just Sunday school. Then they were learning not just to be able to read, they'd also learn how to write. Then they'd learn how to do other things as well. And so, people could see the value of education. And so a lot of church schools were started. So next door to a church, often they own quite a bit of land, then a primary school would be started. So even till today, between a third and a half of schools in England are church schools, started by congregations. So people thought, well, we're a congregation. We realize the value of education. Why don't we get together, raise some money, build a school on our church land, and employ teachers? And so that's how the educational system developed in Britain. Sort of widespread education. There were always private education, there were always boarding schools, public schools, independent schools, but sort of broader education was very much done by the church. Local government is organized on a parish basis. There are prayers in Parliament till today, the opening of Parliament. If you want to reserve your seat in the House of Commons, you only have the right and the authority to reserve your seat if you turn up for morning prayers in the House of Commons. Then you can leave your card on your seat, because there are not enough seats in the House of Commons for the number of MPs that there are. So you can only reserve your seat if you turn up for prayer, morning prayer. So the trade unions, or the Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist Party, it was started by Christians. Tony Blair was a very devout Christian. There have only been two leaders of the Labour Party that were atheists. That was Jeremy Corbyn, the recent one, and Michael Foot. All the rest of them, they were strong Christians. So that's just the way it was. Universities are founded by Christians, by the church. So that's how it was in England. If we look in Scotland, you have something similar but different taking place. You had the Scottish Enlightenment. One of the main figures there was someone called David Hume. He was the most thoroughgoing skeptic and empiricist. He's actually my favorite philosopher. I think he's one of the greatest philosophers. He wrote it, and so as an empiricist, he developed his whole political philosophy upon a very clear understanding of human nature. So his first book was a treatise of human nature. What is it? What are human beings like? Not from a rational point of view, but just describing, analyzing, thinking about, reflecting upon experience. He drew up a theory, a treatise on human nature. And when I read this about 30 years ago, I thought, wow, this is amazing. He actually discovered what we call the three blessings. He calls the three laws of justice, but it's exact. It matches on. He understood that. Very interesting. Anyway, so based upon that, he developed ideas of the free market. This is the way the economy does develop the free market. He's a humanist. He was a skeptic. He's an agnostic. Didn't believe in God. He demolished the whole idea of. He demolished the proofs for the existence of God. He demolished the belief in miracles and lots of other things. But a great supporter and sponsor of liberal democracy. So he was like a sort of bulldozer, created a lot of space for liberal thought and thinking. And he had a great friend called Adam Smith. He also was a friend of David Hume and shared basically the same kind of approach, intellectual approach, also very skeptical. And his biggest work was the theory of moral sentiments. So just like David Hume developed a treatise on human nature, Adam Smith, I would say, took it much further. He wrote a series of volumes about what it is to be a human being, the theory of moral sentiments. He's interested in about morality and human beings as moral beings. On that basis, he wrote a pamphlet called The Wealth of Nations. What is it that leads to nations becoming wealthy? And so that he talked there and developed very much the ideas of the free market. And he understood what human beings are like. Human beings are a mixture of guided sometimes by conscience, sometimes are selfish. So what's the best economy for human beings as they are? Not as they ought to be, but as they are. This is the way they are. What's the best kind of economy to make sure that you have a peaceful society in which people can be prosperous? And so he said the free market. Yeah. And, as free market ideas have been adopted in different countries, those countries, without exception, have become wealthy and prosperous. With a free market, I talked about all these things in an earlier workshop. I don't want to talk about them now. Another person there, he's also a skeptic. Francis Hutcheson, again, a great moral philosopher. He was a utilitarian. There's Robbie Burns, the great poet, living at the same sort of time, and again, a great liberal thinker and poet. And there's Thomas Reid, again, another philosopher, principles of common sense. So this is the character of the Scottish Enlightenment. At that time, Edinburgh was called the Athens of the North. It's one of the greatest flowerings of intellectual life since the Greek philosophers in Athens. But the really interesting thing about all these philosophers was they were all friends. They used to meet up together in a tavern, and they used to argue and talk and discuss philosophy. And they used to support each other, philosophical work, publications, and all these different things. They weren't jealous of each other. Some philosophers in some countries, they hate each other because they're jealous if another philosopher becomes more famous than they are. These ones, they were all friends. They used to go and drink together in the tavern. They used to get blind drunk together, but they were friends. And that's really interesting, this kind of friendship group that was there. And as I said, they were skeptics. They weren't atheists. Even though David Hume was a skeptic, he understood the value of religion. He described religion, the way that religion worked, and that religion is a really important way through which moral values are understood and transmitted from generation to generation. So they recognized the value of religion, although they themselves weren't certainly weren't orthodox believers. And most of them were university lecturers. And so out of this then, way of thinking then, came this intellectual life, but also out of this came the Industrial Revolution, which developed. That's what it says in Divine Principle. The Industrial Revolution, which began in England, also developed very much in Scotland and Glasgow with the shipbuilding and lots of other things. The largest car manufacturing factory in the world once was not very far from Glasgow. Industrial Revolution began in England and arose out of God's providence to restore the living environment to one suitable for the ideal world. Promoted trade, which led to empire, promoted spreading the gospel. So look at this a little bit more, because this Industrial Revolution, it flowed out of the Enlightenment. So first of all, in terms of the Industrial Revolution, it's based upon industry, it's based upon technology, that's based upon science, and science is based upon the empirical tradition of experimentation. You do experiments, you develop scientific theories, you can then apply those to the development of technology, and then you can apply that, at least the Industrial Revolution. And so this happened in different places. One was the development of financial markets, particularly in the City of London, still famous as a financial centre in the world on a global level. City of London is a very interesting thing. It's not the whole of London. There's just a political, legal entity called the City of London. It's called within what's called the Square Mile. It's much of it has its own legal courts, has its own police legal system, has its own police force. It has its own Guildhall, which is like a parliament. In many respects, it's quite separate from the monarch and separate from Parliament. Yeah, it's in London. Parliament is based in the city of Westminster, not London. And so to recognize that its independence from the monarchy and from Parliament, whenever the king or queen wants to go into the city of London, they go in their carriage, but as they cross the border, they have to get out of their carriage and acknowledge the authority of the Lord Mayor of London, and various little rituals are done. Anyway, so it's a market. What is a market? A market is a safe place to buy and sell things. So until today, there'd be the fish market, the meat market, buying and selling all sorts of things. And the reason why it was there is because it was safe. There was a legal structure, the rule of law. Nobody could steal, nobody could rob people. There's no arbitrary taxation. There were no protection rackets. There's no organized crime, because the City of London and the people running the City of London made sure it was safe for people to engage in the economy, for people to buy and sell freely without being intimidated. That's why I had independent police force. Anyway, later on, only recently, it's become a financial center as well. You can buy and sell shares, insurance, all these things. And the reason people like to do that, from all over the world, people come to London to have their legal affairs sorted, because you cannot bribe an English judge. Yeah? There's no telephone justice. The politicians have no authority over the judicial system. The judges just apply the law. And there's an independent jury as well. So there's no political pressure upon the legal system. You can't bribe an English judge. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. And so people know if you want justice according to the law, that's where you go. It's also a place people can raise capital for investment and transfer risk. You have insurance. Then anyway, what also happened, particularly in the Industrial Revolution, was mechanization factories. And the reason why this happened is because people started inventing things. The reason people could start inventing things is because they had the freedom to invent things. Yeah. You could come up with an invention, and then you could go and build a factory, and you didn't have to ask anybody's permission to build a factory. If you owned the land, you could build a factory. Then you could buy and sell whatever it is that you produce. You didn't have to ask anybody's permission to buy things or anybody's permission to sell things. There weren't monopolies, because that was one of the principles of the Parliament, is you don't allow the king to grant monopolies. Anybody has the freedom to buy and sell whatever they want. And so you had these inventions, you had development of factories, huge increase in productivity. lowering costs of manufacture, cheap textiles and clothing. And then you had the development of steam power. It's the very first one. James Watt invented that steam engine. It started off used in the mines. In the past, they used to send the children down the mines, because they were little and they would sit there all day long, opening and closing the door. A lot of people died in the mines. All these children died in the mines. A lot of children died in the mines, but they realized actually steam power you can do it more efficiently. You don't have to be connected to a river. You can have power anywhere. And the factories could be built which are away from water power instead of just being run by water mills. And then from that, you had development, transport, canals, railways, ships, tractors. Now, none of these initiatives took place from the king or from the state or from parliament. There was just a framework of the rule of law which enabled people within the law to be able to do and take all these initiatives. And they had development of iron making. The Quakers are very much involved in this. It's the very first iron bridge in the world, built by Abraham Darby. They were Quakers. All the people doing this were non-conformists. They're very religious. And cheap quality iron. And so how do we evaluate the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution, the most important event in the history of humanity since the domestication of animals and plants. It's not the most important religious development or spiritual development, but it's certainly the most important technological, material, economic development since the domestication of animals and plants. That was about 10,000 years ago. Why? For the first time in history, the living standards of the masses of ordinary people have begun to undergo sustained growth. Nothing remotely like this economic behavior has happened before. So if you look at the population of the world over the last 10,000 years, basically it's a straight line. The population didn't increase for 10,000 years until the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, well, it preceded in England by the Agricultural Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution, the first time in human history, it became possible to produce more food and also to produce goods that enabled people's standard of living to increase. So instead of just the king and a few people at the elite having a very high standard of living, for the first time in human history, it became possible for ordinary people to have an increase in their standard of living. So everything that we enjoy today is as a result of that, the Industrial Revolution. Never happened before. So the interesting thing is, well, who were the people who were behind the Industrial Revolution? Well, very, very few of them were members of the Church of England. Basically, they were almost exclusively nonconformists. They were Methodists, they were Quakers, they were Presbyterians, they were Baptists. And you might wonder, why these people? Well, the Church of England, that was the establishment. If you wanted to go into politics, you had to be in the Church of England. If you wanted to go to university, you had to be a member of the Church of England. If you wanted to become a lawyer, go into a legal profession, you had to be a member of the Church of England. If you wanted to go into any of the professions, you had to belong to the Church of England. That was the establishment. The nonconformists, they weren't in the establishment. They were outside the establishment. But a lot of them were very intelligent people. The main thing was they were free thinkers. Whereas if you're a part of the establishment, you had to believe certain doctrines. You couldn't be a free thinker. But free thinking in terms of religion means not just free thinking in terms of religion, it means free thinking in terms of anything. You could start to play with ideas. You weren't afraid of not conforming. You weren't afraid of becoming a radical. You weren't afraid of having ideas which are different. You weren't afraid of coming up with new ideas to do things differently. You weren't bound by tradition. And so the nonconformists, who are very, very intelligent, because they study the Bible, they weren't allowed to go to university, so they started their own technical colleges. So all the technical colleges in Britain, they were all started by the nonconformists. Yeah, if you wanted to study the universities, the main focus there was studying theology, law, going to the professions. The technical education was started by nonconformists. So they were the people who invented all these things, the spinning jenny, the steam engine and things. Quakers, as I said, they developed the iron industry. They also developed banking. What are banks? Bankers are people who look after your money. Who do you want to look after your money? You want you want to feel, okay, I can trust you to look after my money. So Quakers are known to be scrupulously honest. They led very, very simple lives. Yeah, they were very, very simple, very frugal lives. They weren't interested in wealth. They weren't interested in ostentatious living, like members of the Church of England or the Anglican or the establishment. They liked having a very ostentatious lifestyle. The Quakers liked a very simple kind of lifestyle. And so they were scrupulously honest about financial matters. And so it was mostly the Quakers that started a lot of the banks. Barclays Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world, was started by Quakers, the Barclays. And lots of the other banks were started by Quakers, by nonconformists. And because people knew they weren't going to go and steal their money. They weren't financially corrupt. And that's why the banking industry developed there. Of course, values have changed, and now there's lots of problems within the City of London. And the City of London developed upon the moral principle, my word is my bond. You could trust people. You didn't have to have written contracts. The people would say, I'll buy this from you, and you knew that person would buy something from you without a contract. There's also the Huguenots. These were French Protestants who escaped from France. They brought with them glass-making skills from Bohemia, particularly. Also developed the machine tools industries in Britain, started by the Huguenots, steel making, and textiles as well, so mostly in the north of England. And so again, these were nonconformists. People, yeah. So when you have spiritual freedom, when you have intellectual freedom, it means you have the freedom to be creative. Yeah, a lot of creativity goes on with that. And so basically the reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened first in England, as I said, first of all, it's freedom of religion. This is what developed during the Commonwealth period. Yeah, with the Civil War, the rise of the Commonwealth period, all these weird, honestly, there were a lot of really weird groups. Yeah. But with this freedom of religion comes freedom of ideas. People who didn't believe, the ranters, they said, oh, we don't believe in the Trinity. It just doesn't make sense. Oh, we don't believe in this weird idea. So they didn't feel like, they weren't afraid of being heretics. That's the point. If you have freedom of religion, you don't have to be afraid of being a heretic. You don't have to be afraid that you're being called a heretic because you can't be put in prison. So even when after the end of the Commonwealth period and the Restoration, and they tried to turn the clock back and pretend that period never happened, the establishment weren't able to do it. They were reactionaries, but they weren't able to do it. So you had all these free-thinking people around, freedom of ideas, as I said, the freedom to be creative, and with this comes the development of science and technology. And then secondly, you had the development of democracy, the rule of law, which again, Cromwell was the Puritans were really clear about that, the rule of law. The Puritans weren't really interested in freedom of religion. They just wanted the Church of England to be Puritan and Presbyterian, and they wanted everyone to conform to that. But anyway, democracy, the rule of law, you don't need to ask permission from the state. And that's really important. You could come up with a brilliant idea to develop a new machine or a new thing, and you didn't have to ask anybody's permission to set up your own business and to get on and do it. There's no bureaucrats from whom you had to get permission to start your own business and to buy and sell things. You didn't have to get any stamps of approval. And with this, then you also had freedom of association. People were able to meet, form clubs, form parties, form scientific associations and societies. And basically people were able to do whatever they wanted within the rule of law. And then the other really important factor was property ownership. That was also there. People could own their own property. This goes way back to Magna Carta. The king wasn't allowed to steal people's property. And you also had the free market, which I said developed in the City of London and expanded basically throughout the whole of England, that the principles of the free market, the rule of law and justice spread through the whole country, where people felt safe and secure to be able to buy and sell without permission. So that's why there's basic structural changes. So as I said, these similar things took place in Florence. That's why the Renaissance started in Florence. You had a similar thing going on there. The freedom to be creative there in Florence, the rule of law, because they had good government and good governance in Florence, and you had the free market and property ownership. And so that's why the Renaissance took off in Florence and then spread through the Italian city-states. And that's why Tuscany and those parts of northern Italy became so phenomenally wealthy during the Middle Ages. Problems came later, and they're still there till today. But these kind of ideas also developed in Holland, even before they developed in England. So Holland also became incredibly wealthy, and then finally developed in England. And you had the Industrial Revolution and technology, which again then started to be exported and expanded through other European countries, Germany, Switzerland. People learned how to build railways, and then the Swiss railways are an amazing miracle. Well, the people who built the Swiss railways were actually English because they knew how to build railways. And same in German, English technology then was exported to Switzerland, Germany, to France. It was adopted by lots of other countries as well, who actually picked these ideas up and were much more successful at running railways than the English ever were. So what is established here then in Britain is a synthesis of Hebraism and Hellenism. And said that then is a foundation to receive the Messiah. And freedom of religion, democracy, property ownership. So God's 2,000 years, providence has prepared a democratic, social, legal environment which will protect the Christ's second advent. So that happened in Britain. It wasn't only supposed to happen in Britain, but it certainly did happen in Britain. And then expanded then because Britain became because the Industrial Revolution, Britain became phenomenally wealthy and became involved in trade with the rest of the world. And with that, you had the expansion to America, the Puritans and other people. But then also through this trade led to the development of the British Empire. And then that eventually its foundations transferred to Korea, which we'll look at later. That's the British Empire there in the 1920s. It was about a quarter of the world's population. And, these are the most liberal democratic countries in the world till today, these ones here. India is the largest democracy in the world. So I was going to move on now to look at France, but I haven't really got enough time, to be honest, and see how the Enlightenment developed in France. So I'll stop there, and we'll come back to that next week. Then I'll look at the at French history, the way the French church developed, and the way the French Enlightenment developed, and the consequences of the French Enlightenment, how that developed, the French Revolution and what came out of that. And then also look at Germany, the church in Germany following after the Reformation, and how the Enlightenment developed in Germany, the great German philosophers, and again how that developed in the 19th century. And then also look at what went on in Russia, pick up where we left off there, starting with Peter the Great, and how religious and intellectual development in Russia through the 19th century, and how that led to the possibility of Russia going communist.